The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as soft jazz played in the background. The cafe was elegant, the kind of place where the wealthy gathered for business meetings or quiet afternoons with overpriced pastries. The clinking of cups and murmured conversations created a soothing rhythm until a sharp, cutting voice shattered it. "Excuse me," the voice dripped with arrogance. "I think you're in the wrong place." Heads turned. Marcus looked up from his coffee, his dark eyes meeting the icy glare of the woman standing before him. She was in her late 50s, dressed in an expensive beige coat with pearl earrings that screamed old money. Her sharp blue eyes scanned him with an expression of distaste, like she had just spotted something out of place, something that didn't belong. "Are you lost?" she asked, tilting her head, her blonde hair perfectly styled. "Because I'm quite sure people like you don't usually come here." Silence settled over the cafe. A few patrons awkwardly glanced away, pretending to be engrossed in their laptops or newspapers. Others, mostly older men in suits, watched with amused smirks. One man in the corner even chuckled as if this was free entertainment. Marcus exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. His posture remained relaxed, but his fingers curled slightly against the wooden table. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said, his voice calm, measured. Evelyn's lips pursed. "Really? Because this isn't the type of place for your kind." A few gasps escaped from nearby tables. A young woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A barista behind the counter paused mid-pour, eyes wide, but no one spoke up, no one intervened. Marcus let the words settle. He had heard them before, many times in different ways, the polite version, the veiled version, the outright hostile version. It didn't matter how it was said, the meaning was always the same. Evelyn folded her arms. "I know most of the regulars here, and I can assure you I've never seen you before. You must be lost or perhaps confused about the type of establishment this is." Marcus studied her. He had been in enough courtrooms to recognize the type. Entitled, privileged, someone who thrived on the illusion of control, who believed the world operated in a neat little box where people like her were at the top and people like him didn't exist. At least not in places like this. "I come here often," Marcus said finally. "You must have just missed me." A flicker of irritation crossed Evelyn's face. She wasn't used to being challenged. "Well," she huffed, "this is a members-only space. Are you even a member?" A few patrons leaned in now, intrigued. Some whispered to each other. Others simply watched, waiting to see how this would unfold. Marcus took his time. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored blazer, pulling out a sleek black membership card. Without a word, he placed it on the table and slid it forward. Evelyn's gaze flickered to the card, her face tightening. Marcus tilted his head. "I assume you have one too? Or are you lost?" A few soft chuckles rippled through the room. A younger man sitting nearby smirked behind his coffee cup. Even the barista stifled a grin. Evelyn's expression darkened. "I don't need to prove anything to you," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into the barest hint of a smile. He could feel the shift in the room now. The power dynamic had started to change. Evelyn straightened her coat. "This is ridiculous. People like you always think—" She stopped abruptly, realizing the weight of her words. The moment stretched. The entire cafe was watching now, holding their breath. Marcus tapped a finger against his cup. "Go on," he said, his tone smooth, inviting. "People like me always think what?" Evelyn's throat bobbed. She was trapped now, caught in her own words. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. But before she could recover, a deep voice from the back of the cafe cut through the silence. "Maybe you don't belong here." The words came from an older black man in a crisp navy suit, seated in the corner. He had been silent the entire time, watching. Now he folded his newspaper and placed it neatly beside his untouched espresso. His eyes locked onto Evelyn's, unblinking. A murmur swept through the cafe. A few heads nodded in agreement. The tension in the air shifted. Evelyn's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed toward the counter, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Marcus let out a slow breath. He reached for his coffee, lifting it to his lips. It tasted even better than before. Marcus took another slow sip of his coffee, letting the rich bitterness settle on his tongue. His expression remained unreadable, his posture calm. Too calm. But beneath that stillness, a storm brewed. He had learned, long ago, to master the art of restraint. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him and decided he didn't belong. Wasn't the first time someone had mistaken his patience for weakness. And it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. Evelyn, standing before him, still held on to the illusion of power. Her chin was high, her lips curled in a condescending smirk. To her, he was just another black man in the wrong place, an anomaly that needed correcting. "You must think you're clever," she said, arms folded, shifting her weight as if she had all the time in the world. "Flashing a little card doesn't mean you belong here." Marcus exhaled softly. If only she knew. His name carried weight in the legal world. He had spent over a decade dismantling cases of racial discrimination, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. His victories were stacked higher than the pristine white plates behind the cafe counter. He had gone head-to-head with judges, politicians, entire corporations. Yet here he was, still being judged, still being tested, still being told, in not-so-subtle words, that his presence was a mistake. "Let me guess," Evelyn continued, her voice thick with mockery. "You're some kind of charity case? Maybe a diversity hire, a scholarship kid who got lucky?" A quiet chuckle came from the corner of the cafe. Marcus didn't turn to see who it was. Evelyn's confidence grew. She had an audience now. Marcus could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, some expectant, some cautious. A few were waiting for him to explode, to lash out in anger. Others were simply waiting for him to stand up and walk away, head bowed, shame settling in his shoulders. He had seen it before. How many times had he been in this exact situation? How many times had he let it go, swallowed his pride, let ignorance win just to avoid the exhaustion of fighting? He glanced around, scanning the room. A middle-aged white couple sat near the window, their expressions carefully neutral. A group of young professionals, 2 white men and an Asian woman, stayed glued to their laptops, avoiding eye contact. An elderly black woman near the counter watched with sharp eyes, her grip tight around her coffee cup. And then there was the man in the navy suit, the same one who had spoken earlier, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Maybe you don't belong here." Marcus let the words play in his mind. He finally looked at Evelyn, tilting his head slightly, as if studying her. His silence made her shift uncomfortably. "Tell me something," he said, his voice smooth even. "What exactly do you think I am?" Evelyn scoffed. "Oh, I don't need to guess." She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it sound like she was doing him a favor. "You're another one of them," she said, "thinking the world owes you something, thinking you can just walk into places like this and expect, what, special treatment? Respect?" Marcus let out a soft chuckle, not of amusement, but of something darker. Evelyn bristled. "Oh, you think this is funny?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said, "I've spent years in courtrooms, across from people just like you. People who wear their prejudice like expensive perfume, subtle but strong enough to choke everyone around them." Evelyn stiffened. The murmur in the cafe grew louder. Someone near the counter let out a quiet, "Damn." "But you," Marcus continued, leaning forward slightly, "you don't even bother with subtlety, do you?" Evelyn's nostrils flared. "Watch your tone." Marcus smiled, slow and deliberate. "Or what?" he asked. The cafe held its breath. Evelyn's hands curled into fists at her sides. She had expected him to get angry, to shout, to cause a scene, something that would justify the disgust in her eyes. But he wouldn't give her that satisfaction. The power was shifting, and she could feel it. Marcus let the silence stretch. Then, finally, he picked up his coffee again, took another sip, and leaned back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. "As I said," he murmured, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Evelyn's face turned a deep shade of red. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked uncertain. The cafe was no longer just watching her. It was judging her. Marcus could see it, the flickers of discomfort, the shift in the room. Some of the patrons who had ignored the situation were now whispering among themselves. The elderly black woman at the counter was nodding slightly, her eyes sharp with approval. Even the young professionals had stopped typing. Evelyn was losing, and she knew it. But instead of backing down, she did what people like her always did. She doubled down. "You think you're smart," she snapped. "You think acting all calm makes you better than me?" Marcus set his coffee down, steepling his fingers together. "I don't need to be better than you," he said simply. "I already am." A sharp inhale rippled through the cafe. A young woman in the back let out a quiet, "Oh shit." Evelyn looked like she had been slapped. Her lips parted, then closed, then parted again. For the first time she seemed at a loss for words. And Marcus? He just watched, waiting, letting her drown in her own arrogance, letting the weight of the moment sink in, letting her feel for once what it was like to be on the other side. Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. The heat had faded, but the tension in the air hadn't. "Tell me something," he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "Why do you think I don't belong here?" Evelyn scoffed, tilting her head as if the answer was obvious. "Oh, please." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but ensuring the entire cafe could still hear. "Look around, sweetheart," she said mockingly. "This isn't your kind of place." Marcus let the words settle, watching her. "My kind of place," he repeated, his voice quiet, controlled. Evelyn's smirk widened. "Exactly." A few patrons shifted in their seats. A couple near the window glanced at each other, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard anything. The elderly black woman at the counter pursed her lips, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. But the man in the navy suit? He was still watching, studying, waiting. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a familiar pressure that had followed him since childhood. The unspoken rule. Don't make a scene. Don't give them a reason. Don't become what they expect you to be. But today, he was done playing by their rules. "I see," Marcus said, nodding slightly. "And what exactly makes this cafe not my kind of place? The coffee? The overpriced pastries? The fact that my money is just as good as yours?" Evelyn rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't play dumb." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Try me." Evelyn folded her arms, shifting her weight like she was preparing for a lecture. "Places like this," she said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "are about exclusivity. They're meant for a certain class of people. People who—" She stopped herself, but the message was clear. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You mean white people?" A hush fell over the cafe. Evelyn's smirk faltered for just a second before she regained her composure. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Her lips thinned. And then a voice. "Excuse me, sir?" Marcus turned. A white man in his late 40s approached, his neatly pressed shirt tucked into dark slacks. His name tag read, "Daniel Manager." His steps were careful, hesitant, as if he didn't want to get involved, but knew he had to. He offered a polite smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm going to have to ask," Daniel said, glancing between Marcus and Evelyn, "do you have a membership here or a reservation?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten. There it was. Not outright aggression. Not an open demand for him to leave. Just polite discrimination. Veiled, carefully worded, a blade hidden beneath a silk cloth. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "I've been coming here for weeks," Marcus said evenly. "Never needed a membership before." Daniel hesitated. "Well, we have certain policies in place." Marcus leaned back, folding his arms. "And those policies suddenly apply now?" Daniel's polite smile wavered. "I just want to make sure everything stays civil," he said. "We don't want any—" He paused, choosing his next word carefully. "Disruptions." Marcus let out a quiet laugh. "Disruptions." He glanced at Evelyn, who was watching the exchange like a cat waiting for a mouse to walk into a trap. "You see that?" Marcus said, shifting his gaze back to Daniel. "She started this. She came to my table, interrupted my coffee, made it her problem. And now? I'm the disruption." Daniel sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, sir," he said, his tone shifting into something more firm, "I'm just asking if you have a reservation." Marcus held his gaze. "I don't need one," he said, "because I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." The café was completely silent now. A young black man near the counter nodded slightly, eyes sharp with approval. An older white woman near the door adjusted her purse strap, avoiding eye contact. The man in the navy suit was still watching, arms crossed, lips pressed together in thought. And Evelyn? She smiled, like she had won, like she had set this up perfectly. Marcus could see it now, the way her confidence had returned, the way she stood just a little taller, knowing she had the manager on her side. "Come on," Evelyn said, sighing dramatically. "It's not that deep. Just take your coffee and go." Marcus didn't move. He refused. Because if he left now, what message would that send? To every black person who walked through these doors, to every kid who had ever been told you don't belong here, to every person who had ever swallowed their pride just to avoid confrontation? He wouldn't be part of that cycle. Not today. Marcus took another slow sip of his coffee, savoring it. Then, setting the cup down gently, he met Daniel's gaze and spoke, his voice calm, steady. "I'm not going anywhere." The café held its breath. Daniel hesitated, caught between wanting to avoid escalation and the expectation that he should do something. His eyes flicked toward Evelyn, who was waiting, arms folded, her confidence growing. Marcus could feel it, the pressure building. Would security be called? Would they ask him again, this time more forcefully? Would they try to remove him? He wasn't sure. But he did know one thing. He was ready. And whatever happened next, he would not be the one to back down. For a moment, Marcus wasn't in the café anymore. The sound of coffee machines, the murmurs of the crowd, Evelyn's smug expression, all of it faded. He was a child again. 8 years old. Standing on the front porch of his family's small home, gripping his mother's dress so tightly his knuckles turned white. Flashing red and blue lights painted their neighborhood in violent colors. His father stood in the yard, hands raised, his face frozen in a mix of fear and disbelief. "I didn't do anything." His father's voice was calm, steady. "You got the wrong man." But the officer didn't care. Marcus remembered the handcuffs, the way they snapped around his father's wrists like cold, merciless teeth, the way his mother cried, shouting for someone, anyone, to help. But the worst part? The neighbors watching from their porches, some whispering, others shaking their heads, and one man laughing. Marcus never forgot that laugh, The way it sent a chill down his spine, how it buried itself deep into his memory, a wound that never fully healed. That moment shaped him. It made him who he was today. A man who refused to be pushed out. A man who refused to back down. Marcus blinked, snapping back to the present. The cafe was silent, all eyes on him. Evelyn still stood there, arms crossed, her smirk curling like a knife against his skin. And the manager, Daniel, was waiting, expecting him to leave. Marcus exhaled. He wasn't that little boy on the porch anymore. He had power now. He knew exactly how to use it. "Let me ask you something," Marcus said, shifting in his seat, voice smooth, controlled. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Oh, this should be good." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "What makes you think you have the right to judge who belongs here?" Evelyn's smirk twitched. The shift was subtle, but Marcus caught it. She wasn't expecting that. "I don't judge," she said, rolling her eyes. "I just know what kind of atmosphere places like this are supposed to have." Marcus tilted his head. "And what kind of atmosphere is that?" Evelyn hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. Marcus seized the moment. "Let me guess," he continued, voice smooth. "You walk in here, see someone who doesn't fit your image of this cafe, and suddenly it bothers you. Not because I did anything, not because I caused any problems, but simply because I exist in a space you think I shouldn't." Evelyn scoffed. "Oh, don't make this about—" "It is about that," Marcus cut in, his voice sharp now. "You didn't question anyone else. You didn't walk up to that guy." He gestured toward a young white man in a hoodie, scrolling through his phone, "and ask if he belonged here." The man in the hoodie looked up, startled. Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed. Marcus pressed forward. "So tell me." He held her gaze, unwavering. "Who gave you the authority to decide where people do and don't belong?" The cafe held its breath. And then a voice. "I was wondering the same thing." Marcus turned. A woman in her late 30s, dark hair pulled into a loose bun, stood near the counter. She was white, but there was a fire in her eyes. She crossed her arms, looking directly at Evelyn. "Who exactly made you the gatekeeper of this cafe?" she asked, tilting her head. "Because last I checked, this wasn't some exclusive country club." Murmurs rippled through the cafe. A few people nodded. The elderly black woman at the counter let out a quiet, a small, approving smile forming on her lips. Even the man in the navy suit, who had been watching silently all this time, gave a slight nod. For the first time, Evelyn's confidence cracked. Her face flushed red. Her fingers tightened around the designer purse on her arm. I was just pointing out," she started. "That you're a racist?" the woman cut in bluntly. Evelyn gasped. "Excuse me?" The woman didn't back down. "You heard me." Evelyn's hands balled into fists. "I am not a racist." "Then maybe stop acting like one," the woman shot back. The cafe shifted. A small but powerful moment. Because Evelyn had lost control. She wasn't the one commanding the room anymore. She wasn't the one with all the power. Marcus saw it, the way her breathing quickened, the way she glanced around, realizing she was no longer in friendly territory. And the best part? She hated it. Her face burned with frustration, her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. But she wouldn't back down easily. Not yet. Because Evelyn wasn't the type to admit she was wrong. No, she was the type to get even. And Marcus knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Evelyn stood frozen, her face still flushed with anger. She had lost control of the room. The people around her, the same ones who had quietly ignored Marcus just minutes ago, were now questioning her. And she hated it. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her phone. She wasn't just going to stand there and let some nobody humiliate her. No, she still had one last move. Her nuclear option. Evelyn's fingers flew across the screen as she dialed. Then, with the perfect blend of panic and fragility, she brought the phone to her ear. "Hello? Yes, I need the police. There's a black man here harassing me. I think he might get violent." The cafe fell silent. A slow, collective gasp rippled through the room. Even the woman who had defended Marcus looked stunned. Marcus, violent? He hadn't even stood up, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything except challenge her arrogance. And yet here she was, painting him as a threat. It was a script as old as time. Marcus felt the weight of it settle over him like a heavy, familiar shadow. He watched as Evelyn's performance unfolded, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable, her hand clutching her chest like she was genuinely afraid. The cafe manager, Daniel, took a cautious step back, as if the accusation alone made Marcus dangerous. And just like that, the air changed. A shift so sudden, so sharp, that it sent a chill down Marcus's spine. The same shift he had felt as a child, standing on that porch. The moment when fear turned into a weapon, against him. Marcus slowly placed his coffee cup down. This was about to get ugly. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. The police were fast. 2 officers pushed through the cafe doors, their presence immediately suffocating. One was older, in his late 50s, his eyes cold and unreadable. The other was younger, but his expression? Pure hostility. He was already gripping his holster. Already target-locked on Marcus. Evelyn let out a dramatic gasp, taking a step back as if she had been saved from some terrifying danger. "There," she pointed. "That's him. He's been threatening me." Marcus didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. The younger officer didn't care. He stepped forward fast, his hand tightening around his gun. "Stand up. Now?" Marcus stayed seated. His hands rested on the table, visible, non-threatening. Yet the officer's fingers inched closer to his weapon. The cafe held its breath. Everyone could feel it, how close this was to spiraling into something tragic. The older officer finally spoke. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "And what exactly am I being accused of?" Evelyn pounced on the question. "He was harassing me," she exclaimed. "I just wanted to enjoy my coffee, and he started getting aggressive." "Aggressive?" Marcus asked, his voice eerily calm. "Yes." Evelyn clutched her purse, her voice rising. "He was intimidating me. She hesitated just enough before adding, "I was afraid for my life." There it was. The magic words. The younger officer immediately took another step toward Marcus. But before he could do anything, Marcus moved. Slow, controlled. He reached into his coat pocket. A ripple of tension shot through the room. A few people gasped, thinking he might be reaching for something dangerous. The younger officer's hand yanked at his gun, but before he could draw it, Marcus placed a business card on the table and slid it forward. Smooth, effortless. The older officer frowned. The younger one hesitated. Evelyn squinted, trying to read the small print. And then her face drained of color. The card was crisp, expensive, the gold lettering catching the light. Marcus Reed, ESQ. Civil rights attorney. Silence. A long, unbearable silence. Marcus leaned back, finally breaking eye contact with Evelyn. Instead, he looked directly at the officers. "Before we go any further," he said, his voice level, controlled, "I'd like to remind you both that I know the law inside and out." The power dynamic shifted so fast it was almost dizzying. Evelyn stumbled back, her hands shaking. The officers exchanged glances. The younger one's jaw locked, his arrogance suddenly replaced by caution. Because now? This wasn't just some random guy. This was a high-profile attorney. A man who could tear them apart in a courtroom. A man who knew his rights. A man who couldn't be bullied. Marcus tapped the business card with one finger. "And just so we're clear," he continued, his voice still infuriatingly calm, "there are at least 15 witnesses here who will confirm that I never harassed anyone." Eyes flicked around the cafe. People nodded. The woman who had defended Marcus earlier folded her arms, her expression sharp. Even the cafe manager, who had been subtly siding with Evelyn earlier, looked uneasy. The officers hesitated. Evelyn's confidence shattered. And Marcus? He just smiled. Because he had just turned the table. The power had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Evelyn, once smug and untouchable, was now standing frozen, her face pale. The officers, who had entered ready to drag Marcus out, now hesitated. The younger officer, the one who had nearly drawn his gun, stared at Marcus's business card like it was a loaded weapon, and in a way it was. Because now they had a problem. They had messed with the wrong man. Marcus sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But his voice? His voice was pure steel. "Officer," he said, slow and deliberate, "I'd like you to read my credentials out loud, just so we're all clear on exactly who I am." The older cop picked up the card, cleared his throat. And in the tense silence of the cafe, his voice rang out. "Marcus Reed, ESQ, civil rights attorney, former prosecutor, legal consultant for wrongful arrest cases." A ripple moved through the crowd. People murmured. Some exchanged glances. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if reality had just punched her in the gut. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. His aggression evaporated, replaced by something closer to fear. Because now he knew one wrong move, and he could be the next headline. Marcus's gaze landed on him. "Now tell me, officer," Marcus continued, his voice still calm but edged with something sharper. "Do you still want to arrest me?" The cop clenched his jaw. "Look, sir, there was a call made." "A false call," Marcus cut in smoothly, "which, if I recall correctly, is a crime." The tension cranked higher. Evelyn flinched. Marcus turned toward her, his eyes piercing through her arrogance like a blade. "Did you know, Miss Parker, that filing a false police report is a misdemeanor offense, and depending on the situation, it can even escalate to a felony?" Evelyn's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Her hands clutched her purse strap so tightly her knuckles turned white. I didn't file a report," she stammered. I just called because you lied." Marcus cut her off, his voice sharper now. "Because you weaponized law enforcement, hoping they'd do your dirty work. Because you assumed that your word, your tears, would be enough to ruin a black man's life." Evelyn's breathing grew shallow. The crowd? They were watching her now, really watching her. The same people who had once been neutral were now judging her. The woman who had defended Marcus earlier? She smirked. The cafe manager? He shifted uneasily, realizing he had almost sided with the wrong person. And the officers? They weren't looking at Marcus anymore. They were looking at Evelyn. Marcus tilted his head. "Tell me, Evelyn," he said, voice laced with quiet menace. "What exactly were you hoping would happen when the police arrived?" Evelyn blanched. She knew. Everyone knew. She wanted Marcus dragged out in handcuffs, humiliated, maybe worse. But now the only person humiliated was her. I just felt unsafe," she whispered, voice cracking. Marcus leaned forward, his stare unforgiving. "Unsafe," he repeated. The word hung in the air like a dark cloud. "You felt unsafe sitting across from a black man drinking coffee?" he asked, his voice a low, lethal thing. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, like she could make all of this disappear. But it was too late. Way too late. Marcus turned to the officers. "Gentlemen," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "I believe we have an attempted false police report situation on our hands. Should we discuss potential charges?" The older officer sighed. He knew they had no case against Marcus. And now, Evelyn was the one in trouble. He turned to her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped, "we take false reports very seriously. If you knowingly lied to law enforcement, there are legal consequences." Evelyn snapped her head up. Her eyes widened in terror. What?" she gasped. The younger cop, still embarrassed from earlier, wasn't feeling generous. "Yeah, ma'am," he added coldly, "wasting police resources, that's a chargeable offense." Evelyn shook her head furiously. I didn't mean—" Marcus cut her off again. "You didn't mean to get caught," he corrected. "That's what you didn't mean." Evelyn staggered back, panic flooding her features. Marcus could see it happening, the cracks in her perfect image, the walls of her privilege crumbling around her. And he wasn't done yet. He turned to the cafe manager. "You," he said. The manager flinched. "I believe you were ready to escort me out, weren't you?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. The man swallowed hard. I didn't want trouble," he mumbled. Marcus smiled coldly. "Trouble? You mean the kind where you automatically assumed I was in the wrong? The kind where you were willing to sacrifice my dignity just to avoid making a scene?" The manager turned red. He knew he was wrong. He knew he had almost played into something ugly. And now he had to face it. I apologize, sir," he said, voice low. "I should have handled this differently." Marcus stared at him for a long, painful second. Then, finally, he nodded. "Yes," he said simply, "you should have." Evelyn was still shaking, eyes darting between the cops and Marcus. The officers were done with her. The crowd was done with her. And Marcus? He wasn't angry anymore. Because he had already won. He stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. Then, without looking at Evelyn again, he turned to the officers. "I think we're done here," he said smoothly. And just like that, he walked out, leaving Evelyn standing there, exposed, humiliated, and powerless. Evelyn was still standing there, shaking, exposed, and powerless. Her perfect world? Shattered. Her mask of confidence? Gone. And yet, Marcus knew the truth. She wasn't sorry. Not really. She was just scared. Scared because, for once, her privilege hadn't saved her. For once, she was the one on the receiving end of judgment. The cafe was dead silent. Everyone was watching. Marcus studied her, his sharp gaze cutting straight through her soul. Then, in a voice calm, deep, and razor-sharp, he said, "You thought your word was more powerful than my existence." Evelyn sucked in a breath. The weight of his words hit like a hammer. "You don't fear me," Marcus continued, stepping forward just enough to make her feel small. "You fear a world where men like me don't have to bow to women like you." Evelyn flinched. Because it was true. "You called the police," Marcus went on, his voice calm but cutting, "because you thought they would protect you from your lie, because, deep down, you knew the system was built to believe you, not me." Evelyn's lip trembled. Marcus took another slow step forward. "But today," he said, voice turning ice cold, "today your lie didn't work." Evelyn staggered back, her hands gripping the edge of a nearby chair like the ground was slipping beneath her. She had nothing left to say. No defense. No excuses. Just the sinking, horrifying realization that she had lost. That she had finally been seen for what she really was. The room remained frozen, everyone holding their breath. Then someone clapped, slow, loud, purposeful. Marcus turned his head. It was the woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had challenged Evelyn before. She gave Marcus a knowing nod, her eyes filled with something like respect. Then another clap, and another. And suddenly the silence was broken. A few people murmured in agreement. Others still looked shocked, uncertain, uncomfortable. And some? Some just stared at Evelyn like she was nothing. Marcus let the moment linger. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached for his coffee, took a sip, and smiled. Because the truth was, he never needed their approval. He never needed claps or validation or a crowd to back him up. All he needed was the truth. And today, the truth had won. Without another word, he turned, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the cafe, dignified, unbothered, untouchable, leaving Evelyn behind, alone, exposed, and for the first time in her life, powerless.